There is a kind of childhood that leaves no photographs worth keeping, not because nothing happened, but because what happened was too heavy to frame, too complicated to smile through. Some children don't get the luxury of being children for very long. They learn early that the world is fragile, that adults are not always capable, and that someone has to hold things together, that someone becomes them. If this feels familiar, you already know what I'm describing. You feel it in the way you read a room the moment you walk into it. You feel it in the way you shrink yourself to avoid conflict. You feel it in the strange guilt that rises when you rest, as if stillness itself is a form of betrayal. You were not born anxious. You were trained to be. For most children, growing up is gradual, a slow unfolding over years of play, mistakes, and being caught when they fall. But for some children, that process is interrupted, sometimes by a parent's addiction, sometimes by poverty, sometimes by illness, divorce, emotional unavailability, or chronic chaos. The exact cause varies, but the result is always the same. The child looks around, realizes no adult is fully steering the ship, and quietly decides to take the wheel themselves. Psychologists call this parentification, when a child adopts the emotional or functional role of a caregiver. But that clinical term doesn't fully capture what it costs, because parentification isn't a conscious decision, it's a survival reflex. The child doesn't think I will now become the adult. They simply begin. They comfort the crying parent. They keep the peace between fighting siblings. They stop asking for things because asking feels like a burden. They learn to monitor moods like weather patterns, always scanning for signs of the storm. And in doing so, they sacrifice something that cannot be returned. The experience of being genuinely, fully cared for. The developing brain is not passive. It is always learning, always adapting. And when the environment is unpredictable or dangerous, it adapts accordingly. The amygdala, the brain's alarm system, becomes finely tuned to threat. Not just physical threat, but emotional threat. Tension in someone's voice, the silence that precedes an argument, the subtle shift in a parent's mood. These children become extraordinary readers of other people. They can sense something is wrong before a single word is spoken. This is not a gift, it is a symptom. What looks like emotional intelligence is often the result of a nervous system that never felt safe enough to stop watching. The child didn't develop empathy because they were encouraged to be sensitive. They developed it because their safety depended on accurately predicting how the adults around them would behave. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for emotional regulation, decision-making, and self-soothing, develops more slowly in chronically stressed children. This means the very tools needed to process overwhelming emotions are the least available to the children who need them most. And so, they learn a different strategy: suppression. Don't feel it. Don't show it. Keep going. Here is what no one tells you about growing up too soon. The weight doesn't feel like weight at first. It feels like purpose. When a child takes on responsibility beyond their years, they are often praised for it. You're so mature. You're so responsible. You're the strong one. These words feel good. They feel like love. And so the child begins to build their entire sense of self around being capable, being needed, being useful. But underneath the praise is a painful equation the child has internalized without realizing it. I am only lovable when I am performing. This belief doesn't evaporate when they grow up. It follows them into adulthood, into friendships, into romantic relationships, into their careers. They overwork, they overgive, they apologize excessively. They feel an almost physical discomfort when someone tries to take care of them. Because their nervous system has never learned that receiving is safe, they give endlessly, not only because they are generous, but because giving is the only way they know how to feel secure. Look at the adult who grew up too soon, and you will often see someone who functions remarkably well on the outside. They are dependable, they follow through, they handle crisis with a calm that others find almost unsettling. They are the person everyone calls when something goes wrong. But look closer. Notice how they struggle to relax, even on vacation. Notice how they apologize for things that aren't their fault. Notice how they deflect compliments, minimize their own pain, and instinctively redirect conversations away from themselves. Notice how, when someone asks how they're doing, they always say fine. Not because they are fine, but because they genuinely cannot locate any other answer. They have become so practiced at managing their inner world that they've lost access to it. Psychologists sometimes describe this as alexithymia, difficulty identifying and describing one's own emotions. These individuals can articulate grief in others with extraordinary precision, but ask them what they are feeling and they go quiet. Not because they are shallow, but because they spent years teaching themselves that their feelings were secondary, inconvenient, even dangerous. Intimacy is where the unresolved wounds of early adulthood tend to surface most clearly. The person who grew up too soon often enters relationships carrying two contradictory hungers: a profound desire to be loved and deeply known, and a deep terror of the vulnerability that requires. They may find themselves drawn to partners who need them. This feels natural, familiar. Being the caretaker is the only love language they were ever fluent in. But it also recreates the original dynamic, the one where their needs came last, where love was earned through service rather than freely given. When someone does love them simply and steadily, not because of what they do, but because of who they are, they often don't know what to do with it. It feels suspicious. It feels temporary. Somewhere in the back of their mind, they are waiting for the condition to appear. What do I have to do to keep this? Psychologists describe the attachment pattern that develops in unpredictable childhood environments as anxious attachment, a state of chronic low-level vigilance in close relationships. The person is never quite able to settle, never fully convinced that they are safe. One moment of distance from a partner can trigger a flood of fear disproportionate to the situation, because the nervous system has learned that distance means abandonment. This is not weakness, it is memory. Every person who grew up too soon carries two internal selves that are often in conflict. The first is the functional self, the one who manages, achieves, shows up, performs. This self is competent and often impressive. It has spent decades learning how to navigate the world without needing much from anyone. The second is the younger self, the child who never got to simply exist without responsibility. This self is not weak or broken. It is just young and still waiting. Most of the internal conflict these adults experience, the burnout, the numbness, the sudden inexplicable sadness, comes from the distance between these two selves. The functional self pushes forward relentlessly. The younger self grows quieter and more withdrawn, until one day, usually triggered by exhaustion or loss or an unexpected moment of tenderness, the younger self makes itself known. This can feel like falling apart. It is actually the beginning of coming together. Healing for the child who grew up too soon is not about learning new skills. It is about unlearning old ones, unlearning the reflex to minimize your own needs, unlearning the belief that rest must be earned, unlearning the equation that made your worth contingent on your usefulness, unlearning the automatic "I'm fine" that has replaced genuine self-awareness, and perhaps most importantly, learning to grieve. Not the childhood itself necessarily, but what the childhood prevented, the freedom to be imperfect, the right to be soothed rather than always being the one who soothes. The experience of being a child in a world where adults could be trusted to hold things steady. Grief, for many survivors of early adulthood, is terrifying because it means admitting that something was lost. But grief is also the most direct route to self-compassion. And self-compassion is where healing lives. The work often happens in therapy. Sometimes it happens in relationships where the person for the first time allows themselves to be genuinely known. Sometimes it happens quietly, alone, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon when something breaks open and they finally let themselves cry without knowing exactly why. Every child who grew up too soon deserves something simple that they did not receive. They deserve to have their feelings met with warmth rather than burden. They deserve to make mistakes without consequence. They deserve to be held without having to hold back. They deserve to be young, fully, carelessly, joyfully young, before the world asks them to be anything else. That child is still inside you, not as a wound, but as a witness. A part of you that remembers what it was like before you learned to carry so much. You do not have to keep carrying it the same way. The strength that got you here is real. The survival skills you built were necessary. But you are no longer in the environment that required them. You are allowed to put some of them down. You are allowed to need things, to ask for help, to rest without guilt, to receive love without immediately wondering what it will cost you. The child who grew up too soon grew up because they had to. But you, as the adult they became, get to decide what growing up looks like from here. And maybe, for the first time, you can let it be gentle.